JDL is asking, how many consumer chains can the hub secure? Is it around 100 like Polkadot, or in the thousands or tens of thousands even?
It's an interesting question. At a very high level, I guess, at a very theoretical level, it's unlimited, because each consumer. So with Polkadot, I think it's like I said, I'm not necessarily totally familiar with Polkadot, but they really have to get like some aspect of each block's production has to be done on the relay chain, and so that does put an upper limit on it, because you're moving through this. You have to get them into this kind of single sequence of transactions. With interchain security, that's not the case. The chains don't really interact beyond synchronizing their validator sets. And so in theory, you could have an infinite number of consumer chains. In practice, there are a lot of infrastructure and performance considerations there. So before it really takes off, like at the beginning, consumer chains, even contract consumer chains, are going to need to be kind of manually deployed by the people working at validator companies. They're going to have to kind of set each one up like they do with separate Cosmos chains now. And there's also overhead. Tendermint with IBC actually produces blocks every few seconds, even if they have no transactions. So that's a little bit of overhead. That's always for each consumer chain. It's this fixed overhead right now, and that's going to limit it. I think what's practical for validators to run, and I think I'm not really sure what that limit will be. I think honestly, as long as consumer chain is valuable and is bringing fees, like it will be more about like whether, I think the scaling question is going to be like, how many fees does the consumer chain need to bring in to stay running is really the question. Because if you had a bunch of consumer chains that all are very lucrative, like why wouldn't you keep adding more and more and more? If they're all bringing in a lot of fees, they all cover their own expenses, and there's no hard technical limit to the number of them that can exist. But it's going to be more like driving down the overhead of Tendermint and of Cosmos. And the further that gets driven down, the more it's possible to have consumer chains that maybe don't bring in that much revenue, that are a little bit smaller projects. And I think that's where we're going to see the scaling. That's going to be the scaling frontier, is basically making it as cheap as possible to run a consumer chain so that lower value consumer chains can also be run on that infrastructure. But yeah, for scaling for validators, they can scale horizontally, which means that if they run out of processing power or memory on one of their validator computers, a consumer chain can easily just be put on another computer, and it can just be that. And that's how Facebook and Google scale. That's how that's how web stuff is scaled for 20 years, and that's what interchain security allows, horizontal scaling.
Yeah, and I guess only once it's really out there and being used, we'll see how it will be adopted and how much demand there also is. But I guess when I just came back from Prague from the Gateway conference, there's so many developers, so many people, founders, builders that want to build on Cosmos. And I guess if that option of launching without having to set up a validator set existed already today, would have a lot of a lot of potential consumer chains lined up. Really exciting stuff. Aussie Atom is asking, name one liability to Atom as a result of the hub providing security and how that liability can be mitigated.
Yeah, so as I was saying before, consumer chains, obviously, if it's not a contract consumer chain, and if people are accepting these governance proposals without actually auditing the code of the consumer chains, the consumer chain could create serious problems. Now, it also depends. I think it depends on the specific validators. Now, the validator deploys each consumer chain on a completely separate computer. That adds a little bit to the overhead, but it also would actually sandbox in the same way. And that might actually become the best practice, is that consumer chains go on their own computer, and they're, that way they're not able to harm anything else. But generally, consumer chains, the other thing, those consumer chains are able to slash hub validators for double signing. And so that is only supposed to happen when they actually double sign. But obviously, if there was a custom consumer chain that had malicious logic, it could send fake slashing packets to the hub and result in hub validators getting slashed and jailed for double signing when they didn't actually do it. And so that's the main, I think, vector of attack. And so like for custom consumer chains, you really do have to look at it and make sure it's not malicious before deploying it. So I'd say that's the biggest liability right there. And the contract consumer chain concept kind of eliminates that liability.
Yeah.